Ladies and gentlemen, so without further ado, we will move to the first session of today, and I have the enormous great pleasure to invite for the session the panel Values That We Need to Protect and How to Discuss War with Citizens in Democracy. Incredibly important subject. A fabulous, great moderator, Madame Anja Wehler-Schöck, with the international editor for Der Tagesspiegel. Please, can I invite you to the stage and ask you to introduce the guests.
Good morning and welcome all to this very first panel. Thank you for the kind introduction. It's a great pleasure for me to moderate this panel on such an important topic and how to discuss war with citizens and democracies with a very distinguished panel. It's my pleasure to introduce to my right Rafał Trzaskowski, who has served as the mayor of Warsaw since 2018. He has already held several political positions, including that of Minister of Digitization for his country and member of the European Parliament. Mayor Trzaskowski, let me start by saying thank you very much for welcoming and hosting us in your beautiful city. To my very right is Senator Chris Murphy, who has served as the junior senator from Connecticut since 2013. Times of crisis can be very trying for our democracies and the values that we have built our societies on. And the years of the pandemic and the consequent fallout have certainly shown that. With our panel today, we will be looking at how the Russian invasion has impacted public debate in both Poland and the US, and how we can strengthen the democratic resilience of our societies to prevent negative fallout. With our panelists, we bring together two different perspectives on this issue. One from the US, which has of course been a key supporter in the Ukrainian pushback of the Russian aggression, but looks at the war, of course, from a distant perspective. And the other one from Poland, right next door, and the largest recipient country of Ukrainian refugees. Senator Murphy, let me start with you. Yesterday, the US announced a new $625 million security package for Ukraine. At your panel last night, you mentioned a statement by a Trump associate railing against a recent support package, which was published and then quickly removed. What is your assessment of the public debate on the Russian invasion in Ukraine in the US? How strong are the voices opposing US support for Ukraine?
Well, first of all, it's wonderful to be with the mayor. Thank him greatly for hosting us here this week. Listen, the United States public remains squarely behind Ukraine, as evidenced by our ability to pass a new $12 billion authorization just last week through the United States Congress with broad support from Republicans and Democrats. As I mentioned yesterday on this stage, if you travel throughout the country, whether you're in a Republican-leaning state or a Democratic-leaning state, you're going to see Ukrainian flags out on the front porches of homes and businesses all across America. And I think there are many reasons for that. Listen, we have a strong Ukrainian-American and Polish-American constituency in the United States, but we're a country that has struggled with our own democracy, that maybe has taken our democracy for granted over the years. We obviously had a very high-profile challenge to our democracy in an attempted insurrection in January of last year. And now we see Ukrainians putting their lives on the line to fight for democracy. We see how fragile it is, and maybe we have come to the conclusion that we should fight a little bit harder for ours. I do believe that there is a potential challenge to this consensus coming from President Trump. I do think his political advisors are market testing some messages of opposition to continued aid to Ukraine. There certainly is a constituency in the United States who is always wary of sending aid overseas, and Ukraine is certainly a long ways away. But today, I think Americans are squarely behind the fight for Ukraine. I think they do worry about the post-World War II order falling apart. They have always been proud of the United States and NATO's role in defending that order. And right now, especially as the Ukrainians show such success and bravery on the battlefield, continue to demand that both Republicans and Democrats stand behind the Ukrainian army and the Ukrainian people.
We're now 1 month away from the US midterm elections. Do you see the war in Ukraine having an impact on the elections?
I don't, again, because right now there is really very little division between Republicans and Democrats. To the extent that there'd be any advantage to a candidate in the midterms on this issue, it would be because a candidate isn't expressing enough support for Ukraine. And in fact, in the few instances where Republicans have voted against Ukraine aid, and there have been a handful of Republicans, some Trump loyalists who have voted against Ukraine aid, but a small handful, they have been very defensive to explain why their votes against these budgets were not related to the money for Ukraine. So I don't think this will be a factor in the midterms because of this consensus that I talked about. I think it's an outstanding question as to whether it will be an issue, heading into the presidential elections.
A quick follow-up before I turn to you, Mayor Trzaskowski. You have been a strong advocate for stricter gun legislation. And when we look at the current security context, the war in Ukraine, recent tensions in the Strait of Taiwan with China, narratives around a possible World War III scenario, do you find it even harder to rally support for gun control in the US?
Well, as much as the American public is very much focused on the security of Europe and the security of Ukraine, they are, of course, much more focused on their own security. And we are a country that has had a dramatic increase in gun violence, and that gun violence often comes at the hands of weapons of war. So you've seen a change in the American public over the last really 4 or 5 years, whereby there's now a consensus in the United States that there are certain weapons that need to be in the hands of the military. They want much more stricter control of handguns, and for the first time in 30 years, we were able to pass legislation this year that begins to tighten our laws around gun violence. And so, yes, in the United States, there is a celebration of the military. There is sometimes what I would call a fetishization of military weaponry in the United States, but the country is rethinking that position, and you're seeing now more support for a restriction of those military weapons in private hands than ever before.
Mayor Trzaskowski, Poland has been a true champion in welcoming refugees from Ukraine. It is the country with the largest take-in at the moment. About 1.5 million refugees are registered to be residing in Poland. How has this been felt in Poland, and particularly in your city of Warsaw? And do you see a risk that the warm welcome might be cooling off?
First of all, good morning. Welcome to Warsaw. We're very glad that we're hosting this conference. What you've seen in Poland is this incredible feeling of solidarity towards our brothers and sisters from Ukraine. Is basically civil society in action. Of course, the central government did its part on the border, but this welcoming was really done by the people, by non-governmental organizations, and of course with the help of the local governments. If you remember the crisis of 2015, the Mediterranean refugee crisis, there were 200,000 people coming to Europe in a month. And people were panicking, decision makers were panicking, and we felt overwhelmed. 300,000 people came to Warsaw, to one city alone, in a matter of 3 weeks. And we, of course, welcomed them. Many of them left Warsaw, they went to other European countries, many of them returned to Ukraine, but we still have 200,000 Ukrainians in our city, which means that the population of Warsaw has increased by 12%, almost overnight. The problem is that most of what you've seen was improvisation. I remember that I had to call different cities in Europe and ask my friends, mayors of Amsterdam, Milan, and other cities to send us buses so that we could send people to their cities and to their countries. There is no strategy on the national level. The Prime Minister has declared just a month ago that the refugee crisis is over. And unfortunately, sadly, there is also no strategy on the European level because the Polish government didn't ask for it. So there is no voluntary relocation scheme. The budget is very, very small. The new money which appeared to actually help us out, and I know that that's a problem of the member states, not of the European Commission, because the European Commission and the European Parliament are well aware of the problem. By the way, I've seen American money on the ground first through UN agencies, then European money. Thank you for that. My heart, as a convinced European, bleeds, as you can imagine. But of course, this support is incredibly important, which came from the international community, the United States as well. Now, what are the problems? The problem is that yes, the support is still there, and it's not waning for sure. But the problems are before us. Long strategy, long-term problems of education. We have 80,000 kids in Warsaw alone. We've enrolled 20,000 kids already to our schools, but there's still 60,000 in Warsaw. Healthcare, social policy, and so on and so forth. Most of my psychologists who should work with the inhabitants of Warsaw after 2 years of pandemic, after this vicious attack of this government on the LGBT community, we need our psychologists. They work with refugees, and we are fine with that, but of course, that puts an enormous strain on the city, and we are at capacity. So, coming back to your question, the solidarity is still there, but if we do not have a strategy, if we do not share the burden, then of course we might run into problems. Most of our Ukrainian friends are with us, with ordinary people, and once the winter comes and you know the energy bills are soaring, many people might say, you know, I cannot do it anymore. So the situation might get much more tricky, and that's why we should be watching closely what's going to happen. But the Ukrainians, and that's what the senators said, I mean, we talk about values all the time. I mean, our Ukrainian friends are fighting for them and dying for them. So we need to do our bid, because in a certain sense, we're also on a battlefield here in Poland and in Europe. Everyone is watching. Every crazy despot in the world is watching, whether we will stay united, whether we will still be tough, whether we will be welcoming. So we're also passing a test.
Well, thank you very much, Mayor Trzaskowski. You mentioned the coming winter, rising prices, energy crisis. What could be done to prevent social unrest or growing hostilities?
Well, as I've said, we need a strategy. We need financial support. We need European solutions, because otherwise it will be immensely difficult to deal with the effects of the war. The solidarity is there. The West was united. We were quite tough and completely different reaction to that of 2014-15. Thanks God for that. But now we're really facing a test, because now there will be a price to be paid by our citizens with the soaring prices of energy, with inflation, and so on and so forth. And now the task of all European and international decision makers is to fight the fatigue syndrome and to keep on convincing people that if we relent, if we renege on some of our promises, if we are not going to support Ukraine militarily, then we're going to fail as a transatlantic community.
Well, you mentioned the fatigue syndrome, and I think communication is key in times of crises. How can we bridge the dilemma? How can governments, politicians, experts communicate transparently with their public about looming threats, about current crisis scenarios, while avoiding fear-mongering and panic among their population? Senator Murphy.
Well, I think, in the United States, the danger is that the war in Ukraine fades from the front pages and from the top of news shows, and the attention of the American public begins to fade. Now, over the course of the last 30 days, it's been back in front of the American public because of high-profile incidents like the attack on the pipeline and the heroic progress of the Ukrainian people. But I think to the mayor's point, we are trying to explain this in terms that the American public can understand, that this is a means to prevent future conflict, that the Chinese in particular are very much watching what happens here in Ukraine, and their battle plans for Taiwan may be dependent on whether they see the Russian forces stopped and whether they see the Russian economy falling apart. And China is very much a present daily conversation in the United States. So there is an ability to message to the American people that this is, yes, about standing up for the Ukrainian people, but this is also about making sure that the United States doesn't get dragged into future conflicts. Now, admittedly, we don't feel the pain in the same way right now that perhaps Poland does. We have inflation, but not as high. We have energy prices that are increased above 2021 levels, but not as high as they are in Europe. So the pain is significant in the United States, but it's not at the same level as it is right now in parts of Europe. And so that doesn't mean that the American public are enthusiastic to endure that, but they, I think right now, see the connection between the prices that they are having to pay and the long-term benefit to U.S. national security. But again, there is a real risk that if we go back into a period of time in which people in the United States aren't hearing news about Ukraine, it will be just a little bit harder for leaders to explain why we continue to authorize $12 billion, $20 billion of taxpayer assistance for this mission. I think we can do it. It just becomes trickier.
I want to turn to the threat of disinformation. Prime Minister Morawiecki yesterday mentioned that Eastern Europe has ample experience with disinformation, but that he feels that the West has underestimated this threat so far. Mayor Trzaskowski, how can we fight disinformation? How can we make sure that our societies are resilient against disinformation and political interference by bad actors?
Well, yes. I mean, unfortunately, our friends sometimes were wrong on many accounts, but also when it comes to the disinformation campaigns and the threat coming from Russia, I mean, it is immense. I mean, wherever there is conflict, wherever there are elections which are hanging by a thread, I mean, the Russians are there. And it's not just mischief. I mean, they are undermining our democracies everywhere. And this is one of the most serious threats. And this is not just like me, picking up a phone and then having a Zoom conversation with a guy who looks and speaks like Vitaly Klitschko, and then it turns out that it was just some pranksters from Russia, of course, there to discredit Klitschko, to discredit other mayors. Because that's relatively benign compared to what they do to our public discourse. And this is incredibly important that we have tools at our disposals to fight it, and that also American companies, this is very important on the net, make their effort to take it down, to expose it, because otherwise our public will be disinformed all the time and manipulated into taking the wrong decisions. Of course, that also puts an enormous responsibility on some of our governments, because some of our governments are also spreading propaganda and lies. So this is important, that if you want to, point a finger at something, you should be heeding the call yourself. But this is one of the most important threats, that we are being manipulated, that our democracy is being undermined, and that this is real information warfare. So I know that the European Commission is doing a lot in order to counter that. but we should be doing more, much more, especially when it comes to the internet, especially when it comes to the social media. We need to expose it, we need to take it down, we need to verify the information. And the last thing I want to say is education. I have kids, my daughter's 17, my son is 13. Sometimes I sit with them, we talk, we check out the homework and so on, and I always say, what's your source? I mean, Google, with all due respect, is not the only source of information. And Google verifies its information mostly, but sometimes you just get information out of the blue on the internet. So verify your information, and you have to teach children to do exactly that. And I know that American companies are working on it to also verify information and to have special techniques in order to fight misinformation and lies, but we need to do more, and we need to teach our children that they need to verify the information that they use. This is a very important skill that we need to teach.
Thank you, Mayor. Senator Murphy, how can we fight disinformation without impeding freedom of speech, for example?
Well, listen, I agree wholeheartedly with the mayor. We are simply not doing enough. Years ago, I wrote legislation along with Republican Senator Rob Portman, establishing something called the Global Engagement Center. And this is a capacity of the State Department that helps fund independent and objective media around the world that fight disinformation, the fact checkers, the truth tellers. And we put about $60 to $80 million a year into that program. That's a drop in the bucket compared to the amount of money that the Chinese and the Russians are spending on disinformation. It just makes absolutely no sense that we are not putting more money into combating disinformation globally. The problem in the United States is that this is becoming a very partisan issue right now. Republicans increasingly take the position that the social media companies should engage in zero content moderation because their belief is that content moderation is somehow subverting and depressing conservative voices. So you are about to potentially have Elon Musk take over Twitter with a promise that he will not only allow President Trump back onto the platform, but really ramp down a lot of the efforts to stamp out the most extreme voices. So we're in a difficult position in the United States because one party right now is not taking seriously the issue of making sure that some of these incredibly nefarious actors aren't spreading lies online. At the very least, though, in the United States, the foreign-run media, we can do something about that. So we have a radio station, for instance, in Washington, D.C., one of the most powerful stations in Washington, D.C., that is owned by Sputnik Radio. So you have literally Russian propaganda being piped into the nation's capital every single day. You have TikTok, still largely unregulated in the United States, a Chinese-owned social media app that is right now the most popular amongst our children. So we're having a difficult time in the United States when it comes to sort of what we do on social media platforms, but some of it shouldn't be as difficult. We should be putting more money into these international efforts, and we should be drawing some brighter lines in the United States, especially when it comes to the foreign-owned information propaganda sites that right now are proliferating inside the United States.
I just want to, I of course agree with the senator, and yes, there is a debate about, of course, as always, freedom of speech and so on and so forth. But I mean, most of the Russian propaganda is propagated by bots and by artificial sites, and these can be readily identified. So at least let's start with that. It should be not that controversial, because I mean, if there is a real there is a real person behind it, then we can debate it, okay? And of course, there are some people who are paid to spread lies, and so on and so forth. But most of the propaganda is just simply, mechanically generated. So let's start with that, and I think that should be at least relatively uncontroversial.
And before we turn to the audience for 1 or 2 questions, I wanted to ask you, Mayor Trzaskowski, to speak a little bit about the Pact of Free Cities that you started in 2019 with the countries from the Visegrad Group. Has this made a difference in Warsaw, and can this be a best practice for other cities to build resilient democratic societies?
Well, yes. There are quite a lot of networks of cities, both in Europe and in the world. I'm also a proud member of the Committee of the Regions, Eurocities, C40, which fights with global warming. But we've decided to create a network of cities who are a bit more political and who want to fight for values of democracy, transparency, tolerance, and openness. We started the four mayors of the Visegrad countries, Budapest, Bratislava, Prague, and Warsaw, because we also wanted to demonstrate that our part of Europe can also stand for freedom and transparency and tolerance in those difficult times. But then other cities joined, such as recently Berlin, Brussels, but also Paris, London, Los Angeles, and so on and so forth. And we are sending a message that we can collaborate, that we can learn from one another, and that we can be a voice for democracy. Because it somehow happens that populists do not win cities. It is much more difficult for them. It is also about direct financing from the European budget, a little bit for city initiatives and so on and so forth. And I'm very glad that the administration of President Biden has very similar ideas, because they have created this pact of cities for democracy and signed a declaration signed by so many cities in different parts of the world. In a certain sense, we all are getting involved in global politics. Look at Warsaw. When I was becoming a mayor, people were saying, yeah, you will just look into the future, construct infrastructure, and so on and so forth. And it turned out that it's sixth wave of pandemic that we're dealing with. We're running 11 hospitals. That it's the war, the migration crisis, and so on and so forth. And suddenly, because the government, the current central government in Poland cannot deliver on its promises, 2 days ago the Deputy Prime Minister said that we should be selling coal and distributing coal. Those are the ideas that the government has. Anyhow, we are at the forefront of all of those challenges that are before us. Global warming, digitization, fighting misinformation, and so on and so forth. So that's why the role of the cities, whether we like it or not, has become global. And we better do something about it, and we better be recognized as important actors, especially for those forces who want to fight for democracy, openness, freedom, transparency, and tolerance.
Thank you, Mayor, for this passionate plea. I'd like to invite you to ask a question to the Senator or to Mayor Trzaskowski. If you're interested, please raise your hand. Yes, the gentleman over there. Please go to the microphone in the back and briefly introduce yourself.
Dear Mr. Mayor, dear Mr. Senator, I would like to ask you a short question. How do you evaluate last Twitter of Elon Musk about Russian-Ukrainian Peace Act, and should the leaders of public opinion of such scale to express their opinion on such important political issues?
Well, listen, I mean, this isn't the first time that Elon Musk has offered a controversial political opinion. It's not that people in the United States don't take his suggestions and opinions seriously, but they form their own. And right now, as the American people watch both the heroism and the effectiveness of the Ukrainian army's ability to take territory back, it seems like a particularly foolish time to be advocating for a capitulation. So at the same time that Elon Musk was suggesting that we give away territory to the Russians, the United States Congress, as I mentioned, was supporting a new $12 billion authorization of military aid. Now, I think my position is the same as the Biden administration's position. It is up to the Ukrainian people through their government to decide for themselves when and if there is a moment to sit down across the table from the Russians and enter into a negotiation. But right now, the American people, I think I can safely say, have no interest in forcing that discussion to happen. In fact, right now, the very opposite is occurring. We are trying to provide more leverage and more support for the Ukrainian military.
I mean, I'm just going to quote President Zelensky, because just an hour after Elon Musk tweeted, he also made a quiz. Which Elon Musk do you like more? The one who was helping Ukraine with Starlink and so on and so forth, or the one who is trying to make political statements? That's for you to decide.
Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we've already reached the end of our discussion, so I'd like to thank our two panelists and stress that with the winter coming, that will certainly pose challenges. We need to make sure to stress openly and transparently to citizens to stand by the commitment to support our friends and partners in Ukraine. And with that, thank you very much, Senator Murphy and Mayor Trzaskowski.
If I may, I was always finishing with one sentence, which is enjoy Warsaw and spend as much money as you can. But in those difficult times, I want to say just one thing. Looking at this incredible courage and resilience of the Ukrainian people, we in Warsaw, we are helping because we know when a crazy guy wants to wipe out your city from the map. That's what happened to Warsaw, which was destroyed in 90%. So when we see Ukrainian cities, we are absolutely certain that they will be rebuilt, that they will be dynamic, and this incredible courage of the Ukrainian people will carry the country forwards. Slava Ukraini!
Thank you.